In a couple of years, Australia's test side might look completely unrecognisable. They're the number one ranked test side in the world right now, and they've reached the last two World Test Championship finals. But there's a problem on the horizon, and it's actually one they've faced before, nearly 20 years ago. Cast your mind back to the start of the 2006-07 Ashes. A legendary Australian side bounced back from the disappointment of 2005 and won the series 5-0, their first Ashes whitewash for 86 years. But with it came the end of an era. Justin Langer, Glenn McGrath and Shane Warne all retired at the end of that series, while Damien Martyn retired 2 tests into it. Adam Gilchrist followed about 12 months later in January 2008, and Stuart MacGill after a tour of the West Indies in June of that same year. Fast forward 6 months, Brett Lee, Andrew Simons and Matthew Hayden all played their last test over the course of a 2-1 home series defeat to South Africa. 9 huge names, all gone from the test set up in the space of 2 years, as well as having moved on from Michael Kasperovich and Jason Gillespie before the 2006-07 Ashes. The fallout was pretty spectacular. Australia lost 3 Ashes series in a row, dropped to number 5 in the ICC Test rankings, and cycled through 62 players from January 2008 to December 2015. Between 1999 and 2007, they only used 40. And that's the danger facing this current Australian side if they're not careful. To put it simply, the core of their squad is old, to the extent that their likely 11 for the first Ashes test this winter could actually have a higher average age than the 2006-07 team we've just mentioned. There are probably 9 players nailed on for selection, and of those 9, Cameron Green is the only player who'll be under the age of 31 on the first day of the series. And in the event that Pat Cummins isn't fit to start the series, he'll likely be replaced by a 36-year-old Scott Boland. There are 2 remaining spaces in the 11, one for another opener alongside Khawaja, as well as a number 3 or number 6, depending on team composition. If Australia were to back Sam Constas alongside one of Marnus Labuschagne or Bo Webster, the average age of that 11 will be around 32 years and 9 or 10 months. And that's about as young as it's likely to get. But Constas has struggled a bit since his debut, so what if that ends up being Labuschagne's route back into the side? With Marnus opening and Green and Webster both in the 11, the average age of that 11 would jump to 33 years and 10 months. Factor in the possibility of Boland starting the series ahead of Cummins, we're up to 34 years and 2 months. That's 1 full year older than the 2006-07 team, who are considered to be an old team. At the very least, Australia will comfortably be 3 years older than the average age of England's 11, possibly pushing 5 years. So, how have they found themselves in this position again? Well, I've done some digging. Since the World Test Championship began back in August 2019, Australia have played 57 tests and used a total of 34 players. But here's the interesting thing. Of the 629 total appearances made by Australians in that period, only 33 had been made by players aged 23 or under at the start of any given test, 5.25%. And only 78 had been made by players aged 24 to 27, 12.4%. That means 82.35% of the test appearances made by Australians in the last 6 years have been made by players aged 28 or older. Looking at the other 8 teams who compete in the World Test Championship, New Zealand are the only side with a distribution of age profiles remotely similar to Australia. They've actually had even lower representation for players 27 or under, with nearly 85% of total appearances by those aged 28 or above, and their results have significantly worsened since winning the inaugural WTC. One explanation for the data is Australia have been a largely successful side. As we said before, they're the number 1 ranked team in the world with 36 wins from 57 tests and only 2 series defeats from 17, both against India. They won the 2023 WTC final and were runners-up in 2025 too, and as such they haven't had a huge turnover of players. Khawaja, Lyon, Smith, Stark, Hazelwood, Cummins, Head and Labuschagne all played a part in the 2019 Ashes series at the very start of the period in question. That's 8 of our predicted 25-26 Ashes 11. Mitchell Marsh featured then too, and he's been in the 11 as recently as last year's BGT, playing 4 of Australia's 5 tests against India. If you compare that to England's 2019 cohort, Ben Stokes and Joe Root are the only regulars likely to make the 25-26 squad. Jofra Archer looks like he'll be there too, but he's played so little Test cricket since that breakout 2019 summer that he's almost like a new player. And there's no guarantee Chris Woakes makes the playing, let alone the starting 11. Looking at the data for Australia between August 2019 and July 2021, the splits across the different age brackets are pretty healthy. But fast forward to the next period, the percentage of appearances by players aged 24 to 27 drops dramatically as the data starts to skew right, with 32 to 35 rising by 9%. The same then happens again between June 23 and June 25, with players aged 28 and above now accounting for more than 90% of appearances. But while Australia's 11 has grown older together by sticking with a broadly similar group of players, pretty much every other team has undergone some sort of squad regeneration. Australia's appearance percentage for players 23 or under never breaches 10% in any period, nor does the 24 to 27 age bracket, with the exception of August 2019 to July 2021. Compare that with England, for example. 22.18% of appearances were by under-23s in period 1, including debuts for Zach Crawley and Dan Lawrence, and plenty of game time for Sam Curran and Ollie Pope. England's under-23 percentage has actually never crossed 10% since then, but unlike Australia, they've continued to introduce new players in the 24 or 27 bracket. Period 2, which spans the second WTC cycle, saw a whopping 12 debuts, including Rayan Ahmed, Harry Brook and Matthew Potts as under-23s, and 5 between 24 or 27, and then another 7 debutants aged 27 or below in period 3, the duration of the third WTC cycle. And even if some of those have barely played since, there was at least a willingness or a need to test out new talent. The same goes for India, whose under 23 and 24 or 27 numbers in period 2 were the second and third lowest respectively of any side. They've rebuilt by giving out 13 debuts since June 2023, 6 to under-23s and 5 to players between 24 and 27. Pakistan and Bangladesh have had consistently high under-23 representation throughout, while current world champions South Africa always have strong numbers between the ages of 24 and 27, as do Sri Lanka. We've already touched on them, but New Zealand might actually be the worst offenders. They of course won the 2019-21 WTC with an already old core and had a win percentage of 62.5% in period 1, but have struggled to regenerate since, their win percentage dropping to 45% since August 2021. So much so that in period 2, directly after that WTC win, 93.33% of their appearances were made by those aged 28 or above. Now that did drop to 76% in period 3 thanks to a bit of investment in the 24 to 27 range, but the 32 to 35 bracket rocketed to more than 60%. And in period 4, since June 16th, 2025, the start of this fourth and most recent WTC cycle, it's even more damning. Now, we don't have much data to work with, but New Zealand have played 2 tests so far in Zimbabwe, which were not part of the WTC. That's crucial. With no points on the line and up against a struggling opposition, it was the perfect opportunity to test some younger, less proven players. But what did they actually do? Well, to be fair, 3 players made the test debuts, which was good. But even still, 15 of the 22 appearances were made by players aged 32 to 35, nearly 70%. So, why do some sides seem to favour youth more than others? Well, there are generally 3 reasons for picking any player. At a very basic level, one is because they're extremely talented and just worth their place in the 11 regardless of age. Runs and wickets are ultimately the currencies that matter most, so putting together a run of form that's impossible to ignore is the best way of breaking into a side. That's what Harry Brook did in the 2022 English summer. Another reason for selection is based around something a bit more intangible: promise. There's not much value in throwing youngsters into high-pressure contests for the sake of it if they're not equipped with the skills to survive. But talent ID and scouting systems run deep in the modern game, and some players are earmarked for the top from a very young age. So much so that it's deemed worth finding out about them in a challenging environment if the opportunity arises, rather than giving that spot in the 11 to a more established player. Think how England have managed Jacob Bethel, for example. And the third reason? Well, a team just might not be very good, so they're constantly looking for players outside the current setup to bring into the side. But as we've already established, Australia are not a bad team. In fact, they're quite the opposite. They've been the best side in the world for the last few years at least, and are probably favourites to retain the upcoming Ashes. So why the panic? Well, it's not about the immediate future. It's in the next 18 to 24 months where their reluctance to blood new talent could hurt them, because it's not clear who replaces the golden generation. Of the 34 players Australia have used since August 2019, 13 have been debutants. Only Bangladesh have a lower new player percentage, with England and India both in excess of 50%. South Africa's figure is a bit of an outlier, by the way, owing to the weakened squad they sent to tour New Zealand during the SA20. So where are those debutants now? Green and Carey are regulars, Webster's done a decent job in his first 7 tests, and Boland is an overqualified backup seamer, but that's about it. Constas is definitely one for the future, but he was plucked from nowhere last winter and might still be too raw right now for the Ashes. Fellow opener Nathan McSweeney, who Constas replaced, fell out of favour quickly during the Border Gavaskar Trophy. Still only 27, Will Pucovski could have been the solution at the top of the order, but he was forced to retire on medical grounds. In Todd Murphy and Matt Kuhneman, and to a much lesser extent Mitchell Swepson, they've handed debuts to players who could be second or third spinners for Tours of Asia, but nobody near matching Lions quality right now. A bit like Boland, 35-year-old Michael Neser is a bowler of a lost Australian generation with just 2 tests to his name, unable to displace the big 3 at any point. And then we've got Josh Inglis and Cooper Connolly, who debuted most recently in Sri Lanka. At 22, Connolly is definitely someone who could play a big part in Australia's rebuild. Inglis will be a decent option to have around the squad too, and is a potential replacement for Carey if required, but he'll be 31 in March. By the time his space properly opens up, there's every chance he'll be 32 or 33, at which point the cycle starts again, and Australia miss another opportunity to regenerate part of their 11. The upper end of that age scale is only going to become more of a problem too. Combining periods 3 and 4, more than 20% of Australia's total test appearances since the 30th of June 2023 have been made by 5 players aged 36 and above. Now, they're not alone. Other teams have, of course, given game time to players of a similar age, but the difference is that most of them have moved on from their stalwarts now. Look at India, for example, with 4 players and 16.67% of appearances by those aged 36 plus in that same period. Rohit Sharma, Virat Kohli and Ravichandran Ashwin have all retired now, only leaving Ravindra Jadeja. It's a similar story with England moving on from Anderson and Broad. Woakes is perhaps the only survivor, and even that's not guaranteed. Angelo Matthews and Dimuth Karunaratne have both retired for Sri Lanka. Tim Southey and Neil Wagner have hung up their boots for New Zealand, while a now 36-year-old Trent Boult hasn't played a test since 2022. So, which players have Australia actually moved on from over the last 6 years? Peter Siddle and James Pattinson both finished playing before COVID, but they were only ever really peripheral fast bowlers behind the big three. Matthew Wade and Tim Payne both played their last test in January 2021, the latter replaced as keeper by Carey, and the former no more than a spare batter when Australia were at full strength. The only regular of this generation to properly call time in his career was a 37-year-old David Warner at the start of 2024. Averaging barely 30 across the last 3 years of his career, he probably managed to retain his place in the side longer than he should have done, owing to a perceived lack of better opening options. And at some point in the next year or two, some of Warner's former teammates are going to have to follow suit. 2027 is a huge year for Australia, with tours to India and England, an ODI World Cup title defence, and another potential WTC final if everything goes to plan. At the start of that 2027 Ashes series, Khawaja would be 40 and Lyon pushing 40, with Smith and Boland 38. Stark will be 37, Hazelwood 36, Carey 35, and Cummins 34. So let's have a go at predicting who could fill some of those spots. Let us know in the comments who you think the next generation of Australians will be as well. Finding one new opening batter has been hard enough, so replacing Khawaja as well could be difficult. But if he can find a sustainable method and Australia are happy for him to learn on the job, Constas is definitely a compelling option. He was thrust into the spotlight with that thrilling debut innings against India, taking down Jasprit Bumrah at the MCG, and was retained for a tour of the West Indies on tricky surfaces. And as yet another Australian bat-off begins ahead of the Ashes, Constas has laid down an early marker by scoring a blistering century against India A. Promising 22-year-old Victorian Campbell Kellaway offers a more measured, patient approach and scored more than 700 runs in the Sheffield Shield last season with 2 tons, as well as a quick 88 in that same innings against India A as Constas. Jake Weatherald is also in the mix, according to Chief Selector George Bailey, after he topped the Shield run-scoring charts in 2024-25 with 906 runs and averaged north of 50. He'll already be 31 though by the time the 2025-26 Ashes get underway, but could be a solid pick for the next couple of years. Beyond those 3, it's not out of the question Australia could revisit some familiar faces like Cameron Bancroft or Marcus Harris as stopgap options, both of whom will be 33 this winter. Matthew Renshaw is a couple of years younger, just the right side of 30, and then there's McSweeney, who was thrust into the spotlight this time last year, or 2-test wonder Curtis Patterson and his infamous average of 144. If Labuschagne can rediscover his previous form, he's of an age where he can continue at number 3 for the foreseeable. But what about younger potential number 3s? Well, we could include Harry Dixon, top run scorer in Australia's most recent Under-19 World Cup triumph, or Teague Wiley, who scored a century in just his second Shield game at the age of 18 back in 2022. Cam Green seems a pretty safe bet to be Smith's replacement at number 4, while Cooper Connolly, who we mentioned earlier, he's got a decent chance of cementing a spot in the top 6, either purely as a batter or a left-arm spinning all-rounder. 19-year-old Oliver Peake, who made 50 on Shield debut at 4 for Victoria and 92 against Sri Lanka A as an 18-year-old, is another top-order option. Aaron Hardy could offer real value as an all-rounder, though Bo Webster might feel hard done by being moved on so quickly. Already with 31 white ball games for Australia to his name, Hardy bowls with decent pace and swing and is an accomplished middle-order batter, averaging 38 in first-class cricket. If and when Carey hangs up the gloves, it probably will be Inglis who'll take his spot, even though he's already in his 30s. Australia like cross-format continuity, and Inglis could definitely offer that for a couple of years, especially with a lack of young keepers on the scene. But the biggest changes will be seen in the bowling attack. Stark, Cummins, Hazelwood and Lyon have held down those 4 spots for years, and the quicks have dominated across formats as well, so there are going to be some seriously big shoes to fill. Already 31, Brendan Doggett is probably next in line after Boland, having impressed in the 24-25 Shield and for Australia A. He was around Australia's BGT squad in late 2024 and a travelling reserve for the World Test Championship final. A former Bradman Young Cricketer of the Year, 25-year-old bowling all-rounder Will Sutherland took 22 wickets at an average of less than 20 in last year's Shield. He's got captaincy experience with Victoria and the Melbourne Renegades and was a late call-up to the Australia A setup for their Red Ball Tour of India. A teammate of Sutherland's 24-year-old Fergus O'Neill was the 24-25 Shield Player of the Year. Now, he's a fair bit slower than Australia's current group of quicks, but he's a bit of a domestic red ball cheat code. 133 career wickets at an average of 20.03, including a stellar stint with Nottinghamshire in the County Championship. Xavier Bartlett probably isn't that high up on the list right now, but at 26, he's of the right sort of age profile if he puts a decent run of first-class form together. He's shown strong skills and ability to move the new ball in ODIs and T20Is, but he too would be on the slower side at around 130 Ks. Had it not been for injuries, Jai Richardson would have had a really strong chance of properly breaking into Australia's test setup over the last 5 years or so. Richardson made his T20I debut as a 20-year-old and his test debut against Sri Lanka at 22, but he hasn't represented his country since June 2022. He's still got excellent pace and wicket-taking ability and has only recently just turned 29, so has time on his side if his body cooperates. The same can be said for the wild thing Lance Morris, who recently opted to undergo surgery to address a stress fracture of the back and will be out for at least the next 12 months. Of Australia's successful 2024 Under-19 World Cup group, Callum Vidler is probably the most exciting quick. He impressed in the 24-25 Shield final and was included in Australia A's white ball squads to tour India, but he's since been ruled out with a stress fracture. Under-19 teammate Tom Straker was also in that squad, while Mally Beardman and Charlie Anderson are both battling back issues. In terms of replacing Nathan Lyon, Todd Murphy is perhaps the most natural like-for-like fit. He's already played 7 tests, impressing on debut in India and filling in for Lyon during the 2023 Ashes, though the gulf in class was vast. Left-hand spinner Matt Kuhneman is another contender, having also featured on that same tour of India, as well as picking up 16 wickets in 2 tests in Sri Lanka. Beyond those two, Western Australia's Corey Rocchiccioli is another off-spinner in the frame. He's played a few games for Australia A against India and has taken 84 wickets in his last 2 Sheffield Shield seasons, the most of any spinner. A short county stint with Warwickshire this summer in tricky conditions was more encouraging than it looks on paper too. Tanvir Sangar's worth a shout, but being a test leg spinner is a pretty difficult job, while someone like 22-year-old Zandan Jay would be a big punt. He's never even played state cricket but was called up to the Australia A squad to face Sri Lanka in July this year. It's a difficult balance to strike because the bulk of Australia's core are still reliable performers and definitely worth their place in the 11. But if they want to avoid a repeat of those tough times in the late 2000s and early 2010s, they're going to have to put some trust in fresh faces pretty soon.